think like
textbook.
like a chapter with one solution, all working on one solution. But I think we're also seeing separately.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, no, it's not what this was.
Okay. There we go. And go hop on down to chapter 2. Here, page 11. There we go. Okay, so hopping down to chapter 2. So the first thing we want to do is fire up Visual Studio 2019. And we're going to actually start a new project in there. So when you fire up 2019, you should see a screen like this. What we want to do is go over here and say Create New Project. Okay. There's a bunch of different options here. Let's go for web. So I'm going to pick web as the project type. And then there's a few different options here. So I want to pick ASP.NET Web Application, .NET Framework. Make sure you pick this one. This one up above here, ASP.NET Core Web Application, is not the one you want. So we're going with this one. We're going to hit next on there. We need to give it a name. So for this particular project, we're going to call this Party Invitations. Or actually Party Invites, all one word. So I'm going to camel case that, and I'm going to not put a space in there. The other thing I need to make sure I do here is point it at wherever my repo is. So for me, that's on my desktop. And it's going to be under Homework, Unit 2. I'm going to say Select Folder, but this is not actually where I necessarily want to put it. So I'm actually going to put in /party invites at the end. Actually, no, I think that should be fine.
So does that create a folder?
That should be fine.
Add?
Yeah, I think actually it should create a folder when I add it. So party invites, so it should create a folder under there. New version of 2019 is different, so I know how 2017 works. We'll see if 2019 works the same way. Or works differently. Okay, so does everybody have that? Party invites as the name of your project. You've all got it pointed into your Homework 2 folder. Okay, so I'm going to hit Create. I'm going to get a few more options, right? So we got Empty, which is going to create a project that's just not got anything in it, right? You see that there's another option here for web forms, right? If we were building a web forms app, that's what we would pick. If you were starting with an MVC and all the fancy kind of the default setup, we would start with this MVC. This is kind of the usually for real world software, you're usually going to pick MVC and start there. But to kind of explain how all the pieces fit together, we're going to start with empty projects for most of the semester. Because this puts in a lot of things, and then it's like, well, how does that stuff work that it added in? Web API, this is specifically, that is there for creating what we call a web API. It's for creating kind of a set of functions that you can call, but that doesn't have any front end. So if you're creating one this way, that would be a website that doesn't have a front end at all. it's only got a back end, right? SPA, you'll see that. That's kind of helpful. Hey, you want to put everything on one page. And that can be very useful for landing pages.
Is that what we're going to be doing in that lab project, using a single page?
No, you still want to start with empty.
Okay.
Just start with empty for now. Later we may switch over to using the MVC, but the only ones we're going to use for this class are going to be either the empty or the MVC starting points. The reason for that is we can add anything we want to it to those. So you'll notice there's check boxes here on the right. So if I start with an empty project and I say add MVC or add web API, I can add what's in those other templates to it. So basically, if I wanted to add web API, I would actually go here to the MVC template and add web API, because more often than not, you're going to have both a front end and a back end, not just one or the other.
Okay.
So, but we're going to start with empty with none of those checked. Actually, we may need, let's go ahead and check MVC. Let's go ahead and check MVC. Configure for HTTPS. Yep, so that's what we need. The other big thing that we'll come back to later on, this authentication option is pretty important, but we'll come back to that when we talk about user accounts and such. So empty, MVC checked, we're going to hit create. Okay, so a basic project, it should have this welcome screen for you. And go ahead and close that. Let's go over and look at what's in the Solution Explorer. So we've got, at the root, we've got our solution. Now remember, a solution, what is a solution? It's a group of projects, right? So I can actually have more than one project in this solution, okay? But for now, we'll only have one project. When we get into databases, we'll actually have a database solution, a database project in there as well, not just the web application. So there's our application. There's a few different folders that you can see that it's created, right? So let's look at some of that there. App data you can see is empty. App data is usually where we ship data that's kind of included with the application. So if we have some seed data, we might ship that there. This route config file is actually where we're going to change our default routing. Let me go ahead and switch some of these lights off so you can see better at this point. Let me push that up to 125%. Yep. So what you're going to see is this is kind of your default configuration for routes. So what does that mean? Well, so my URL to my website normally starts with what first? Index. Usually starts with HTTP, right? Base URL for whatever website you're going to be. It's going to be HTTP or HTTPS : / right? So it's going to start with that. That's a given. From there, you've got what your domain name is next, right? So if it would be HTTP : / rankin.edu. That's the first part, okay? Well, the routes is everything within your website. Now that we've gotten rankin.edu, what's all underneath that, right? What folders and such goes beyond that. So this is how the default route is set up. The first word that you put after the domain name, so I say /home, well, that's going to go to the home controller. Or if I say /mycrazyID, it's going to go mycrazyID controller. Okay. The next thing that's in the URL is what we call the action, which is the name of the method on our controller. And we'll get to this more in a minute. So we have the name of the controller, we have the name of the action, and then we have some sort of ID, right? Some sort of unique identifier. So oftentimes this might look like user edit 3. so I'm editing user 3. Or it might be user details 3, so I'm looking at information about user 3. Does that make sense? So usually the first word is what kind of thing am I working with? What do I want to do with it? And which one is it? What's the ID of the one I'm working with? Now, can you see that there's this little section called defaults down here, right? So if I don't pass in any of those things, if I don't specify that in my URL, it's going to go ahead and default the controller to home, and it's going to default the action to index. Okay? So if I just go to Rankin.edu, it would be home index, right? Or if I said Rankin.edu/user, it would be user index. Whatever part you don't put in, it's going to default to home and index. Okay? That's the way the default routes are set up. More often than not, we can leave this file alone and not do much of anything with it with most websites. But if you do get in a case, remember where we talked about yesterday, we had like a fancy URL, it was to-rent Chicago street address. Well, if we wanted to set up something like that, then we need to get into this file, add some additional routes. But for the most part, we're going to leave this file alone. You can also see that there's a folder for our controllers, there's a folder for our models, there's a folder for our views. All of these are effectively empty right now, right? With the exception of views. Now, there is something very interesting here that you do want to pay attention to. Notice that there's a web config file inside of views. Is there also another web config file? There's one on the bottom. There's one in the root, right? So there's a web config file here and the web config file there. Those are not the same. They may have the same file name, but they're not the same. As a general rule, don't touch the one in the views folder. You will break your website. Don't touch, let me repeat that, don't ever touch the one in the views folder. That's not the one you want. What we will get into though is the one that's down here, and this is basically the place where we're going to configure settings that are kind of system-wide that control how our website works. Like for instance, details to connect to a database, or details for, hey, I want to send emails. Well, here's the SMTP settings. So we are going to be changing a few things in here as time goes on. It's a good place to get kind of familiar with some of the sections in there. But when we get to that, just remember you're changing the one in the root, not in the views. Okay. Global ASX. This gives us a place to put some code that runs when the application starts. So when I start it up, whatever I put in here in application start is going to run once and then never again. Does that make sense? So there may be some times when you need to set things up, especially when we're looking perhaps at an inject, that we need to run once. So we would put that in there. Packages JSON. This is just going to manage, hey, what are the third-party dependencies? What other people's code am I using, right? So all that's in here is what? Is MVC. These are the base MVC and ASP.NET dependencies. So that's kind of a rough overview of all the files that are there. Okay, any questions on any of those specific files? Okay, let's add our first controller. So go to the controllers folder. You're going to right-click that, and you're going to say Add. We're going to add a controller here. Now, you'll get a big dialog like this. There's a bunch of options. Where we want to start is MVC controller empty. You'll notice that there's these MVC5, there's web APIs, right? those are the Web API controllers and the MVC controllers are very similar, but there's a good number of differences between the two. The ones that we're pretty much just going to use this semester are going to be these MVC ones. So you can ignore the Web API ones there for the most part. Okay, so it's going to give us a name it's going to now ask us to name our controller. Okay. One rule when you're naming controllers, it has to end with the word controller. If your class does not end with the word controller, MVC will not find it. It will treat it as if it doesn't exist. So make sure it ends with the word controller, which they're giving you a hint there. Notice that the part default is highlighted, right? They've suggested change this part, but not the controller, okay? So if I just start typing, I'm going to type in home. It's going to be home controller. Now remember, why am I calling this home controller?
It's the home page.
Because it's the default, right? Remember when we looked at that routing file, home is that default. So home is going to be that first page that we see. So we're going to say home controller. Okay. And it's actually put in a few bits of code here. So let's look at what it's generated first. So we've got the namespace, right? So party invites controller. Where does that come from? Well, it's the project name, right? Project name is party invites, and then it's in the controllers folder. So that's the default way for it to figure out what the namespace is the name of the project and then the folders. Now we've got public class, home controller. Why do I need to mark it public?
So that it can be used throughout the entire project.
Right. If I don't mark it public, it can only be seen within that namespace that it's in. That make sense? So if I just leave off that word public, then I can't see this from any other folders. That's going to be a problem when we get to our models, right? Because for models, we're going to need to be able to see from the entire application. So we'll make sure we add the word public. Home controller, what's this colon mean? Remember what that colon controller means?
Home controller is inherits controller.
Pretty close. Pretty close.
It extends controller.
Again, pretty close. The usual word what we use is subclass. It is a subclass of controller. In some sense, that can say it extends. Yeah, really, I would say it's a subclass as a specific thing. If that makes sense? So, controller is the parent class for home controller, and we're the child class. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that means that there's a bunch of stuff already built into this controller class that we get to use. And it also means that MVC is able to treat all of our controllers sort of polymorphically, right? Because it knows they're all subclasses of controller, right? So there's some common expected functionality. Now, when we define a method, any method that we define inside of a controller actually gets turned into a route that you can visit on the internet. So now there's a method called index. Well, that inherently means that I can go to home controller /index and get whatever this puts out. If I add another method in there that says calc result, calc total, whatever that is, well, now I can get to home calc total. So just be forewarned, any method you put in here that's public is now something anybody on the internet can get to.
So, like by default, return view will just basically return by page.
We'll get to that in a minute. I have a few things to say about that.
Okay. So if every controller inherits a controller class, why does MVC struggle to pick up whether or not it's a controller if it doesn't say controller at the end, if it's technically a child class of?
Yeah, that's a real mystery as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
I don't know why, between it being in the controllers folder, it being a subclass of controller, I don't know why it has to now be named controller, but it does. For whatever reason, that's the way that they've chosen to pick up what the controllers are. They ignore what namespace they are in, they ignore what subclass they're in, they're just looking at does it end in controller.
Maybe. I'm kind of thinking it might be because I just want to try to force good coding standards for naming files.
That's not necessarily good coding standards.
Okay.
It sounds
To some people it is, but it's not necessarily a good coding standard either.
extra work from Microsoft to make it search for the end of a file name versus just looking through the namespace or folders.
Yeah, I wish, but that's the way they set it up.
Very silly.
That is the way they set it up. So, and this is kind of what we call configuration by convention. You don't explicitly tell it what to do or how to look for the controllers. It just kind of, well, that's the way we normally do it, so that's what it does. So, anyway, so the method needs to be public. That says, hey, we can get to it from the internet. Whatever name I put here for the name of the method, that's going to be the name of the route. Okay? All of our routes will return action result. That's what it's going to be in the entire semester. As long as we're writing MVC controllers, your pages, views, whatever, they're going to need to return action results. The reason for that, there's a bunch of little subclasses to action result that we can use kind of depending on what kind of thing we want to return. So at the root, we have action result. That's the base class for all the different kind of things we can return from an action. Underneath that, we're going to have view result, which is going to be the most common. To just say, hey, I want to return a page. You know, I want to return some HTML. So that's going to be the view result. Another option that we have is JSON result, which is to say, hey, I want to return some data that I'm going to use via Ajax. Okay, we'll get to that in a few weeks. Another option is that I want to return some sort of HTTP status code. Okay. That's generally to do one of two things. If you're returning a status code, so it's to do one of two things. It's to redirect the user to another page, or to tell the user that there's a problem, or that they don't have permissions, things like that. So thinking about that, have you heard the term status code? Have you seen status codes online?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody give me one of the common status codes.
404.
404. What does a 404 status code mean? Huh?
Not found.
Not found. Okay. So that means that whatever link you gave me, it doesn't exist anymore, right? So for instance, if you try to go to user 53 and there's no user 53, well, I'm going to give you a 404 to say that there's no user 53, right? The most common status code that you get back is 200. 200 says everything's good. What are some other common error codes?
I remember seeing 405 a lot, which is...
I'm not familiar with 405.
500 level is like...
500.
Yeah.
Okay. So
yeah.
we've got 200, okay. 200 is okay. We've got 404 is not found. And yes, 500 is an error code. Just raise a hand, who's seen a 500 code before? Okay, where did you see it?
Did you point at me?
Yeah.
So I do websites for a company in Eversville, and our sites couldn't connect
Couldn't connect
to the
to
server. Or
usually the database. Usually the database server.
Okay. Good.
Okay, so usually, so a 500 code means there's an error somewhere on the back end. It means that there's some sort of server error, something went wrong, there's an exception in your code that you haven't caught. Mm-hmm.
500 is like the generic version of that, and like once you go like 5 something like XX, that's like the more specific ones. Is that right?
There are, we usually don't use those.
Okay. it's
So
just
as
like-
far as, as
That's
far as the
generic.
500 range goes, we're usually just going to use 500. So the point is, this action result can be a few different things. It can be a view that we're returning. It can be a JSON result. It can be HTTP error code or a redirect of some sort, right? So that's why we want to make sure that our methods are returning generally action results. Now, as we go through the book, we will see, hey, especially in chapter 2, he's going to go through showing you, hey, well, what happens if we use something else, right? Because we can actually make that return result, the return actually something different. It doesn't necessarily have to be action result, even though generally we will want it to be that. Okay. So we're returning a view, okay? So view is a method on the controller class, and it just says, okay, we call that to say, hey, I want to return a view to the user, right? By default, what it will do is it will go look under the views folder and go look for whatever appropriate view. In this case, it's going to go look for home index, right? Because we're in the home controller, the method is index, right? Well, let's just run this real quick and see what happens. I'm going to run this without debugging, so it's a little bit faster. Yes. And see what we're going to get, right? So we've just added a controller. We haven't added the view, right? What are we seeing? Well, it says it can't find the index view, right? And look at where it's looking. So first place it looked was in views home. So it was looking for views home, ASPX, ASCX, yada yada, until it got down to CSHTML. Well, it didn't find any of those files because we haven't created it, right? It also looked under views shared, right? So so those are the two places that it looked for our view, right? It looked under views, home index, or views shared index. It's looking for a file with one of those names. Well, let's create one so that it has one to find, okay? So I'm going to close this out. I'm going to go right-click on, well, I'm going to go to Views. You'll notice that it's already created a folder called Home. There's already a folder called Home for Home Controller. I'm going to say Add, right-click and Add View. We're going to call this Index. We're going to leave it empty, no model, no template. This box here, if we leave it checked this way, this is going to say, hey, use the default layout. In a few chapters, we'll get to layouts and how those work. But for now, I'm going to uncheck that because I'm not actually going to use a layout right now. Okay, so it's created a basic HTML file for me, basic view, right? So what you'll see is a few different things. So first of all, we've got something interesting happening here, right? At, curly brace, close curly brace. Anytime you see an at sign, that usually means that we're putting C# into our HTML file, into our view, okay? We call that Razor syntax. So most of Razor syntax starts with an at sign, okay? There are a few different ways to write a Razor expression. This is kind of the most basic one. At sign, curly braces, says everything inside these curly braces, well, this is C#, right? Outside of that, we've got a basic template for a web page, right? So we've got our doc type. What's the doc type do? Remember from first semester?
That tells the browser that it's an HTML document.
Partly true. There's one very important part there you're missing. It tells it that it is
HTML5.
It is an HTML5 document, right? It tells it specifically that it's an HTML5 document. If you leave that out, it's going to assume that it's not HTML5. It's going to assume that's older, right? So it's not going to enable a lot of features. So we've got a doc type that says it's HTML5. We've got an HTML tag we're wrapping around the whole thing. We've got our head section. We've got our body section. It's gone ahead and put in this viewport. Remember what the viewport's for? That meta viewport?
Responsive.
It's responsive, right? Yes, it's related to the responsive, but more specifically, give me a more specific answer.
Mobile device.
Mobile devices.
Screen
What is it?
dimensions.
Yes, it has to do with screen dimensions on mobile devices. So if I don't put that in there, it'll think that, oh, you're a desktop app, and have the screen be like this, and your text will be tiny. Okay. So what it tells it to do is to make the width of the page the width of the device. That's what it does. It says the width of the page is equal to the width of the device's. Okay. And we have the title. Remember, that's going to show up on the tab. And then we've got the body. So we've got div tags in here. Well, let's go put some HTML right into the div, right into this body area, so we can just see if it's going to work. Okay. So I put a little HTML in there. Let's go run it. Yay. Notice that it's picked it up, right? Now, if I go and look, I'm going to right click here and say view page source. Okay, so there's the HTML that I put in there. Is there something missing between what's here and what's in the view?
Oh, the razor syntax.
Razor syntax. So all the razor syntax that I put in my views, that doesn't make it to the browser. That's one important thing to know. Anything I put in Razor, that's all run on the server. The browser doesn't know about that. Okay. So the Razor syntax is going to be run on the server, and then the HTML is actually rendered on the client. Okay. There is a separation there. And that will get very interesting once we start mixing Razor and JavaScript, because the Razor will be run on the server, the JavaScript's going to be run on the client. So we'll have both. Graham, you had a question?
Yeah, so how come it removes the .html at the end of the view?
So it doesn't necessarily, I wouldn't say it removes it. It's just kind of that it was never there to start with. So, and that's actually something you want. Because you don't want the end user kind of tied to, or your URLs that you're giving on Twitter or wherever, or Facebook, to be tied to how you implemented your website, right? Well, that extension, CSHTML, if you looked at the extension, is tied to how you implemented your website, right? So it's removing that, because it's not really an important detail, and that way you can change things on the back end without knowing about
So
it.
if we were to add another controller to the home, does the
You mean another action?
yes.
Mhm.
Right. Does the compiler or the whatever reads these controllers and actions just order them on page sequentially, or is there a way to specify that further?
No, they're separate pages. We'll get to that in a minute. So each action, each view will give us a separate page.
Oh, okay.
So that's the basic, hey, we've got that set up. Well, you were asking about live preview the other day, okay? Let's just try this. I'm going to change this text here. I'm going to save it. Okay? No change, right? No change. If I refresh, there it is, right? So remember, anytime you're making a change to a view, you're going to have to go to the browser and refresh it. You have to make sure you save it in Visual Studio and then refresh it in your browser.
So why doesn't it need to like recompile it?
Main reason being, so like Java, right? JavaScript is in what we call an interpreted language. It's just kind of run as is. There's no intermediary form. C# is what we call a compiled language. So anytime you're working with a C# application, it has to take your code and turn it into what we call bytecode, which is close to, machine code is which directly runs on a machine. That's just ones and zeros. It's just instructions to say, do this, do this, do this, and this, at a very low level. Well, bytecode is one step above that. What it is it's instructions for a imaginary machine. The upside of that is by running with bytecode, well, it's more portable. It can run on different machines, different hardware, without being tightly tied to, hey, you have an AMD processor, an Intel processor, or you're running on Linux or Windows. So we run through bytecode to kind of hide some of those details. But that compilation process is costly, right? Is costly. And it kind of has to be done all at once. So when we build the application, we typically kind of have to build the whole thing and then work with it.
Yeah, so how is it able to change that without having to compile it again?
Well, it does recompile the view.
Okay.
It does recompile the view, and it's yeah.
Unchanged?
So
Okay.
when we hit F5, it's going to go to the server. Server's going to say, "Oh, the view file changed. Rebuild it." So
it doesn't just-
all the controllers and models, all the backend, the non-view stuff that we write, that stuff will be compiled at kind of compile time, right? The views, however, aren't actually compiled until a user visits them. They're kind of compiled at a later time, which is why they handle updates a little bit better. Okay, so we've got our basic homepage. We've got some HTML in there. Let's see what's next on the list. So we've added a controller, added that. Okay. Now, let's try something real quick here. I mentioned that we can actually make this return something else. So I'm going to actually make this return a string. Instead of returning a view, I'm going to say return hello world. So it's going to return a string. It's going to return hello world. Okay, so that works. So I can return just basic types like that, right? What's one downside of doing that over not having over a view that you might see?
If you look at the source, it's just hello world. There's no HTML. There's
I
no
can't.
HTML.
Exactly,
It's
right.
just
So if I just do this way, I can't return any HTML, right? I can't actually send HTML back. In fact, let's try that real quick. Let's say I want to put an H1 tag here. How do you think this is going to show up in the browser?
That's gonna be
exactly
as
what it
it
is.
is.
like that.
Real.
I have something.
Oh, it's not supposed to do that.
See what it does. So what it's actually sending to the browser is that, which the browser is going ahead and deciding to show is HTML,
Maybe try different.
even though I haven't really given it valid HTML, right?
And returning a whole HTML document as a string is really practical.
Yeah, you don't really want to do that. But just a fair forewarning, it will let you, right? If I do inspect this, you'll see that it'll have kind of magically added the H, the head, the body, the HTML tags, even though it's not actually there. in the code that's sent back.
Even Internet Explorer does it.
Now, a reminder, so anytime I make a change to this controller, if I just save this and refresh the browser, that's not going to update, right? So if I want to actually see changes that I made to a controller, I need to run it again. So I need to hit this button, and that will have updated the code here. Okay. Well, just like I can return a string, I can return other things. So I could say, hey, I want to return a float. Let's try to run that. Right? So technically you can return pretty much any type, and it'll figure it out. Any of your basic types, it'll figure it out. But that's usually not what we're going to want to do, but it is there, right? It is there, but really what we're going to be doing is primarily views.
So if you want to return like JSON, you have to have like return an action result?
Yes. So if we're returning JSON, yes, it's going to be an action result. We'll get to how that is. It turns out that it's actually really easy. And I've got JSON, name and age. So it is actually really easy to return JSON. We'll get to kind of the details of that later. But that's kind of the magic sauce, is going to be that we use the word JSON instead of the word view there. Okay, so we've got a basic setup, right? So I've got a home page, says hello world. That's a good start. Okay, well, but we'd really like to build on that, right? Okay, so let's go look here, chapter 2. So one thing to note, when we ran the program in the browser, do you notice this number right here? Colon, for me it's 443 and 44339, right? For all of you, it's going to be a different number. It's a differently randomly assigned number. In fact, that number is assigned when you create the project. So when you create the project, you'll get a different random number. Okay? Anybody know what that port means?
No, I don't know
What that number means? Okay. This is what we refer to as a port, right? When we're having services online, okay, we have an IP address which runs the computer, right? That's say, hey, I want to go to this computer, and everybody's got their IP address. Within that, every computer has a series of ports. They're all side numbers, okay? And typically only one application can be running or listening on a given port, right? So if your Discord needs to talk to some other server, some needs to talk to Discord server, that's going to be running over a port on your side and a port on their side, right? So in this case, this is saying, well, which port am I listening for connections to, right? Where are they going to connect in?
So is that like a specific port? Like I think HTTP is 443.
So you can, in the browser, if you do colon
Yeah.
and put in a port number, it will be going over that port.
So that's
If
just a
you
random
leave,
then?
it's just a random
Okay.
one. The default, if you don't specify a port, is port 80 for HTTP, 443 for HTTPS. So normally that's why you can go to Rankin EDU and leave off the port, right? Because it's assuming it's port 80, right? So sometimes, especially oftentimes in development, we actually on Windows won't let us use port 80 unless we're running IIS, because port 80 and port 443 are reserved for IIS, basically.
I've heard about 8080 what is that like something special?
Oftentimes that's one people use because it's just a random free port. It's not assigned to anything.
It's easy to
Right.
remember.
8080. Anything, say 1,000 or above, is usually pretty safe, usually not used by anything. But below 1,000, there's a lot of ports that are reserved, if that makes sense, where you can't use them because they are for something specific. So 80 being HTTP, 443 being for HTTPS, 21 is for FTP. 21, actually I think 21 is SMTP. Anyway, so there's a bunch of reports that are reserved. You'll have a random one there. You won't need to worry about it too much as far as that goes. It will pretty much be invisible. When you actually go deploy this to a real website, that won't be there. It will just be port 80 when you're actually deploying it to a real server. So looking here, when I want to, okay, so that's that. Yeah. Other thing to note, so we talked about IIS. IIS is usually how we actually run live sites. Visual Studio actually ships with something called IIS Express, which is what our MVC sites will be running on as we're testing them, as we're building them. So if you go to your taskbar, you see this little arrow here that I've got highlighted here. I'm going to pop that up. There's an icon here for IIS Express, right? So right click this, you'll see a few options. Sometimes you will need to get into this. Clicking exit will shut down any of the websites you have currently running, right? You can see right now that Party Invites is running, right? So I can go in there and I can say, well, let's go look at it. There we go, okay. I can also go in here and say, show all applications. It will show me everything that's running. So that can be very helpful. Because oftentimes what can happen sometimes, let's say you're working on more than one project, right, at the same time, those other projects may still be running. You may need to go kill them so you can work on a different project. Okay.
Yeah.
Routes.
By the way, it's past 1:30 now.
Okay, so let's go ahead and take a quick break. Come back in, call it 1:50. Yes.
So when I started running my thing, it was running proper, so then I changed it to
Yeah. Oh, that's all fine. It's fine. It's trying to run over HTTPS, and so you just need to tell it that yes, you trust it. You just want to show it yes. Okay. Okay. It's just that you didn't trust. You saw the thing that popped up for me about trusting the server. So you just click on that. get, this is a mess. Okay, cool. And then you'll still need to remember to install the other package, the SQL service.
Yeah, I had that one. The configuration room, that one, or?
It was the Visual Studio installer.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So,
I remember showing that.
yeah, you want to do that
Should I
later.
wait till like tonight when I go home?
Yeah, wait till
so you
tonight
can-
to finish that up, because otherwise, when that's running, you won't be able to use Visual Studio
Okay,
at all.
yeah, let's do it tonight when you go home.
But you'll need that, because otherwise you won't be able to create a SQL Server project.
Gotcha. We don't have these in here?
Yeah, you're fine.
I don't know if it had to be like a later in the
Yeah, we've gone back and forth. The rules have kind of, originally we didn't want basically any drinks in that, but rules have changed.
Okay, I know last year was the G7 for fine.
Yep, those are good.
I find myself drinking an unhealthy amount of them.
You try, find yourself what?
Drinking an unhealthy amount of them.
Well, more than one a day is for sure healthy, and many would say one a day is not healthy.
Well, I usually drink one a day when we have class.
Yeah. Just don't drink any other caffeine.
I don't drink it on weekends, but
There have been cases where people have died because they got too much caffeine.
a kid in my high school actually left on a stretcher because he took like 5 caffeine pills, 200 milligrams each.
Yeah.
So,
Because it will make your heart work faster. So be careful. A lot of caffeine.
he's only have like 160, I think, 140.
I think if I remember what I've heard correctly, it's pretty close to like a full dose and overdose.
Yeah, so
An energy drink is
70 per 8 fluid ounces and of just caffeine, but I don't know if it's got like.
But it's supposed to be pretty. It's pretty close. It's like 2 is 2. Drinking 2 of them is already over the safe limit.
I don't know if these have the taurine or whatever it's called in them.
Taurine actually doesn't do anything.
It doesn't? I thought it did.
It's just a marketing term. It actually doesn't do anything.
I've just seen it on the top of a lot of other ones that.
Yeah, oh yeah,
you know,
they like to advertise it, but it doesn't do anything.
didn't have that.
Mr. Smith. I was thinking of moving where the L2E repo is to save space on my hard drive.
Huh?
I've moving it to a different location to save space on my OS drive. Not entirely sure. So far, all really done. This is the new location. This is the old location.
I don't think you need the old one. Are you using the old one at all?
This one? No, I think I can just delete that.
Probably just delete that one.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the new location.
You should only have one copy of it.
I copied this one and pasted it here, so.
Oh. Whichever one you were using last is going to have the most updated. So I would delete the older one.
Okay, so
You definitely only want one copy of it.
delete this one.
And then the other one, just right click that one and say pull. Just to make sure it's got the latest. Pull. Yeah, and you can see which branch it's on. So actually you won't have my changes because they're not on there. I'm going to put my stuff on the master branch.
Yeah.
Fair forewarning, you want to notice that.
Yeah.
That's fine. Okay.
Close it down.
Yeah, so yeah, you only need one copy of it.
Okay.
There's a program that you can use if you're trying to clean up space. It's called Windirstat.
Okay. Interesting.
WINDIRSTAT. And what that'll do, you can open up and run it, and it'll give you kind of a graph in the LC preview like that. It'll show you what's taking up the most space. And that's a pretty useful tool.
Okay, thanks.
Where your big files are.
Can we get rid of this linoleum, like for my sake, and just use, like, do you get this? It's only on linoleum, like in the bathroom, it's got like tile and it's silence. So they know you're coming.
Yeah.
I notice every single classroom, no matter like the education level, always linoleum floor.
The reason that's used is because it's very good for cleaning up spills.
Also,
It's very easy to clean.
So
I
squeaky.
think it also might have something to do with office chair wheels.
Probably that's pretty cheap.
That too. Huh?
Probably that's pretty cheap.
It's a matter of it's the quickest thing it's the easiest thing to clean. It's not unusual for that to be used in classrooms.
Yeah, and it's going to drive me to the edge of insanity eventually. By the time I'm done with ranking, squeak.
Sorry.
Man.
Throw away the dress shoes. to get rid of
Most
them.
colleges are that way.
Wear tennis shoes?
Some workplaces are pretty lenient.
Oh, my workplace. I can wear tennis shoes. It's not here. Where's the third one pulled out? Where'd you get the small Mountain Dew, Graham?
Okay. So resuming with where we were on Java 2. I'm going to look a little bit. I have said a few things about routes. I do want to show one thing from here. So let's say I've got this page open. Notice that there's, after the local host and the port, that there's nothing there right now, right? So that's going ahead and figuring out that you want home index. I could also put a slash there, same thing. If I said /home, notice that it's going to go ahead and figure it out, right? So if I put in /home index, all of those URLs point to the home page. Does that make sense? All of those URLs. I can include the home index, or I can leave the index out. I can leave the home out. One question here, well, what if I leave home out and just put in index? What am I going to get?
404.
Right? Why? Why am I getting a 404?
What are you?
Why am I getting a 404?
Because you haven't specified the controller, so it doesn't know which one.
I have specified a controller.
There's not a view for index, there's a view for home.
No, there
I
should
have
be.
specified a controller. I haven't specified an action, but I have specified a controller. Which controller have I specified? Remember, if I go /home,
Was it global?
so if I go /home, what controller am I getting?
You're getting the home controller.
I'm getting the home controller. So if I say just /index, which controller am I getting? The index controller.
Oh.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
I'm
So
getting
it's
the index controller.
Controller that doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist, so therefore I get a 404. So anytime you're trying to go for a controller that doesn't exist, you're going to get a 404. So if I want to go for user, well, user doesn't exist, I'm going to get a 404. Does that make sense? All right, so let's go back to where we're at in the book and look at what's next. So rendering web pages, we've looked a little bit about that. We're going to say action result, we're going to say return view. We've seen that error message already. Put in hello world. Okay. So now let's put some more dynamic content in here. So what we want to do is put this code, looking at page 24, we want to put this code into our action. So I'm going to say int hour equals datetime dot now dot hour. And then view bag. Okay, so I've added 2 lines of code to the program, right? Now, if I were to go and run this program right now, what am I going to see? If I try to run this and look at the home page now, am I going to see anything different?
No.
You can see good afternoon or good morning, depending on how it is.
Why don't we go try it?
Because you're returning passes the
Yeah, you're not passing it.
Well, let's look. So I've added 2 lines of code. It's still saying hello universe, right?
Yeah.
So look at the code that's in the view, right? What takes over? It's the code that's in the view. The code that's in the view has hello universe hard-coded, right? Code that's in the view says hello universe hard-coded. Well, let's walk. Okay, so in order to actually show this message to the user, I actually need to include it. Actually need to change some code on the view. So I'm going to change the code on the view like so. I'm going to put an @ sign. I'm going to say @viewBag greeting. In fact, I might want to say @viewBag greeting. Let's just say world, because they put stuff in there too. Okay.
What is viewbag?
So viewbag is one way to pass data between your controllers and your views. It's kind of the simplest way to pass data between the two. It's not necessarily the best way. Best way is actually to use models, but it is one way that we can do this. So viewbag is this what we call a dynamic object. We can add properties freely to it as we want. Until I added the greeting property to it, it didn't have a greeting property. I just added it magically to there by assigning it. If I run this right now, we can see that it's going to say good afternoon world because it's afternoon.
So question, if it was private, would it be able to access, what's it called, the greeting?
If what was private? This method was private?
Yeah.
Let's see what happens. So I'm going to make this private. What did I say previously about thing needing to be public? The method needing to be public.
If you're not in the namespace, you can't access it. It's private.
Let's go look. 404 error. Okay. So if you have a private action method, right? If you mark your action method private, you won't actually be able to get there. You won't actually be able to run it at all. So your home index, it's like it's not there, right? So that needs to be public so that you can actually get to the in the browser at all. Okay, so viewbag, again, dynamic object. We can add any property we want to. It didn't have this greeting property. There's nothing magical about the greeting property. I could have called it pickle, and as long as it's called pickle on both sides, it's going to work, right?
So is the properties like an undefined variable, basically? It could be.
So viewbag, I can create whatever properties I want. I can give them any name I want.
It's like, okay. It's like involved.
It's what we call a dynamic object. It's a dynamic object. Until I've added properties to it, it doesn't have any. And then I add a greeting property to it, now it has it in the view. So it's a quick way to kind of pass things through. So let's walk through what this code is doing just briefly, just to explain it. So this date time here, what is date time? Well, date time is a class, right? And you can tell that because it starts with an uppercase letter, typically. Well, I take that back. You can tell it because the color is highlighting in it. But date time is a class. Now is a property. It's a static property that tells us what the current time is, what the current date and time is. We can pull off just the hour portion of that by accessing the hour property. So we're saying date time class, give me the static now property, and then from there give me the instance property that's hour. So that's the hour. Okay? And we're saying, remember what kind of syntax is this?
Ternary.
To turn it, right? So if the hour is less than 12, it's going to show good morning. If it's greater than or equal to 12, it's going to say good afternoon. Simple as that. These ternaries will come up quite a bit. They're quite helpful. Obviously, we can still use if and else, but there are cases where that makes the syntax a lot shorter. Okay, any questions on this at this point? One thing to note there, so looking at the code and comparing it to the page that we got out, notice that the first part of what we're spitting out, is razor, so it starts with an @ sign, and then I say the name of the variable that I'm accessing, and then all of a sudden I'm back into HTML world, right? So it's treating this part here as just regular text, right? It's not treating that as C# code, but it is treating this part here as C# code.
If you want to do more than one thing, do like what it did up there with braces.
Yes, yeah, if you want to do something more complicated.
Yeah.
One thing that means you need to remember, what happens if I put viewbag.greeting space world,
Yeah.
right? I don't have an @ sign.
It'll think that's a string value.
It just, there. So it's literally just going to show it as viewbag.greeting world, right? So the @ sign says, hey, treat this as C#. This is not text, because otherwise it's going to assume it's text. Yes?
Now, what if you had an, if you had like an email address or something?
Okay. What if I had an email address? What about it?
If you had the @ symbol, like, would it treat it as a variable instead of, oh no, never mind, because you gotta have viewbag, right?
Would you just like escape it?
So let me show this. So let's say I'm going to change this. Or actually, I'm just going to add another property here. Viewbag.email test example.com. Right? So viewbag.email. I'm also going to put this over here. I'm going to put this in a paragraph tag. Anything a problem there with how I've set it up? @ sign. Notice it's not highlighted. So I'm going to say paragraph viewbag email, right? All right, let's run this because I've made some changes to the controller. It's just fine. No problem. I didn't have to escape anything.
I meant in the actual HTML, right? Would the @ symbol
Right.
act as?
But this is to recognize most of the time when you have email, it will actually be data. It will be a variable that you're putting in there. That makes sense?
Yeah.
More than often, this is how it will look. You won't usually be hard coding emails. Sometimes you might, but you won't usually. Okay? So as long as you're passing it through a variable, which is generally what you want to do, you won't have that problem. You won't have any problems with it. If I do, however, want to put it literally there, I think you can already see that it didn't highlight it. Okay? It didn't highlight it.
So what makes it exactly the text, whether it's a
White space.
It's pretty smart. Yeah. It's pretty smart. So one white space is one way for it to detect, right? You'll also notice here that it's detecting it because, hey, there's a tag that's before it, right? So most of the time it'll figure it out, and usually you can see it because it'll highlight it. You know, highlighted it is different. But it's going to ignore an @ sign that's in the middle of text like that. Okay. Now, I do believe I can trick it. If I needed to put an @ sign in the middle of something like that, I can use parentheses. You see that? Parentheses are always allowed, but they're generally optional. I could do the same thing up here if I wanted to be clear about, hey, this is actually C#, do that. Well, why might that be relevant? That I need to specify what's C# and what's not. Let's say I want to put the hour in here too. So viewBag.hour is equal to...
C# code on your website, maybe.
So I'm going to put viewBag.hour and go ahead and pass that down, right? Okay. Let's say in here, I want to say I'm going to put ternary in here. I'm going to say if this is greater than 12, what's the problem?
If you don't have parentheses, it's like, oh, this must be just regular
Right.
paragraph stuff.
It thinks that this is the end of the C# part, right? So if I look at this, it's running, this part was C#, and then the rest of this, it just spit out verbatim. It's like, oh, that's just text. It's not actually code. So if I want to have that actually treat the whole thing as code, I can wrap parentheses around it. And now the whole thing's code.
What?
Huh?
What if you had like an @ symbol, like for a Twitter username, like you had like @ a username?
Yeah, what's your @
So let's say and my clearly my caps lock is stuck.
Is that your @, Mr. Smith?
No. No. Say I want to do that, right? It's treating that as C# code. Any guesses? Any guesses of how I might go around that?
Second @ sign.
Yes. Remember how you escape a slash? You just put another slash. So you just put another @ So if I look at this, double @ is the single @
Also, I know HTML has like certain character codes that you could probably use to insert an @ symbol.
Right.
That ampersand
Yes.
stuff.
Yeah, I could. Yeah. I could. I could use an entity to take care of it. So that's a quick introduction of the basics of like, hey, here's your regular syntax. So again, normally nearly everything starts with an @ sign. All the fancy stuff starts with an @ sign. Say, hey, now I want to do stuff. But sometimes you may need curly braces. Sometimes you need parentheses. Sometimes you may want a double @ like that. Okay. So now that we've got kind of those basics out of the way, right? We want to start building an actual application, our first application. Okay, so here's the requirements for this application that we want to build. Here's what we're going for. Imagine that a friend has decided to host a New Year's Eve party and that she's asked me to create a web app that allows her invitees to electronically RSVP. She has asked for 4 key features. Okay? A homepage that shows information about the party, a form that can be used to RSVP, some validation for the form that checks that everything's valid, and then shows a thank you page. And then she also wants to be emailed anytime somebody RSVPs. Okay, so this is what we're trying to build. We are going to be going very quickly over a lot of different territory as far as this rest of the chapter is concerned. We'll dive into more of the explanation in the future weeks. But just know we're going to write a lot of code at this point. We'll come back and kind of explain it. So that's what we're trying to go to, right? So basically, how would you break that up? If we're thinking about pages, how many different pages do I need to make this happen?
2.
Huh?
Is it just 2? Different
Well,
pages?
What's my first page?
Oh, never mind.
Huh?
Say 3.
So, but what are those pages?
Oh,
So somebody give me that first page.
Oh, welcome page.
Your home page. Okay, so we got home page. What's page 2?
Form.
RSVP form, right? What's the third one? Thank you to say, hey, you submitted everything good, email sent, okay? So there's going to be 3 pages to this website. Right, pretty small. Okay. So what we want to start by doing is build that first page. So I'm going to actually comment out all the stuff that I'm going to actually get rid of all the stuff I have here. Actually going to go ahead and do is go ahead and check it in. Just as a future reference, this is a good point to go and we'll check our code in. And let me show you how to do that through Visual Studio. So I'm going to go to the Team Explorer window. You may or may not have this open. So to get to it, go to View, Team Explorer, and that will open up like this. What we want to go to is Changes. And what you'll see here is it's got all those files we just created. Does anybody have something that's not related to party invites in their list of changes?
I do, yeah.
What do you have listed in there?
I had accidentally created a view with a layout so it installed Bootstrap.
Okay.
So then I just need to delete content though.
I would just leave that alone for now. Okay, so we're going to actually use Bootstrap in a minute anyway.
Okay.
So that's fine. So we want to go ahead and check that in. I'm just going to give that a comment. My first app. I'm going to say commit all. That's going to go through. You should see a message like this. So it shows you commit number. It's not currently pushed, so I'm going to go to click on changes. I'm going to hop over to sync, and I'm going to say push. So that's all I got to do. If I want to push those changes up, I just go commit them, and then I push them, and we're good. Now the reason I'm doing that is because I'm about to throw away most of the code in here. Okay? So in the view, I need to bring in the code from the book. So I'm going to get rid of everything that's currently in the body. And I'm going to change that to the text that's in the book. We're going to have So one of the things you'll notice immediately, the text, the code from the book is not going to make this look very pretty. The text in the code from the book is just the very basics. So what I would ask you to do, and part of your homework today for tonight, is to go through this and then to make it look nicer, put in pictures, put in Bootstrap 4, all those kind of pieces to make it look nicer. Okay. So that's the code we have. That's the code we have there. Okay. I might want to go ahead and change this title, so I'm going to go ahead and say home page for the title of this page. And now what we want to do, let's go look at it real quick. So we have the text there. Nothing pretty, but we've got the text. Okay. Let's go back. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just strip out all the code we have here and go back to just the basic home page. So that's all that's going to be in our home controller right now. Okay. So in MVC, the usual part that actually drives our design is going to be the model part of that. So typically our websites are kind of usually the best place to start with a client is actually usually from what data do you need to store and work your way up, right? You can kind of think about, okay, well, what pages do you need and work your way down, but it's usually helpful to go the other way and start with what's the data they need to store and work your way up from there. So what we're going to do next is we're actually going to create the model for this RSVP component. So I'm going to go into Solution Explorer. I'm going to right-click Models. I'm going to say Add. I'm going to add a new class. Okay. Add a new class to the Models folder. Okay. That class I'm going to call Guest Response. So you're going to end up with something like this. Note that it's already made the class public. Yay. I think if I remember right, Visual Studio 2017 didn't do that. It just left it package access. So the next thing we need to do is add a bunch of properties. That's just taken directly from the book, page 27. So ideally, if you're working with your customer or your client building a website like this, where you're going to start with this process is find out what fields do they need on their RSVP form. And so from there, we're going to say, okay, for all the people that RSVP, I need their name, I need their email, I need their phone, and I need to know whether or not they will attend. Right? So what you can see here is I'm probably going to have 4 fields on my form. Right? Does that make sense? That correspond to these properties I have here. You can see that the data type of the name, the email, the phone, those are all strings. But what's going on here with will attend? Bool question mark.
It allows it to be null.
Allows it to be null. So I can say, I don't know if I will attend. I can say maybe. The big reason that's there is you need to catch and know whether or not the user has made a selection. So the null lets us know, has the user made a selection or not, because otherwise the default is what? The default is false. The default is they won't attend. So if they forget to check the box that says they will attend, or forget to make the selection that they will attend, it'll just assume, oh, they're not attending. Right? Well, that's not ideal, because now you have a bunch of people that show up, even though they said they wouldn't show up. Right? So we want to for sure guarantee that we know whether or not they picked yes or no. Does that make sense? So that's why that we want to allow null there, is because we want to make sure the user has picked an option. Why don't I need that question mark on these other fields?
I guess because, well, they'll be required, right? And like, you can't just not.
Well, all 4 of them are
Oh, yeah.
required. All 4 of them are required.
Can't string already be null?
String can already be null. Why can string already be null? Caleb?
What?
Why can string already be null? Why is string allowed to be null?
Does it have a default value?
Does it contain nothing?
Because an empty string is not the default.
So, no, an empty
Yeah.
string is null is the default, but that's
Yeah.
not
Null
why.
isn't the same as an empty string.
Yeah.
So, bool, right? There's a difference between bool and string that is important.
String isn't. String is just a string of characters. It's not an
And I'm
actual.
looking for a very specific reference, a pair of keywords,
The
technical terms.
file size of a string is variable.
It is, and that's part of why it is a reference type. String is a reference type. Bool is what we call a value type. Okay. There's a difference between value types and reference types. All reference types can be null, but any value types that we have to put that question mark on there to allow them to be null. Okay. So what are some other value types? Integer, float, decimal. All of those are, any of your integers, so bool, int, and floats, all of those numbers, those are going to not allow null by default. If I were to create a struct, structs are also value types. Okay. But any class that I create, so string is a class, okay, those are reference types. So what that means is they can be null. The way that that works has to do with how they're stored in memory. Okay. So if I have a value type and I say, well, I have this variable that holds a bool, right? Well, the actual value of that, or I have an int, that 3 that I store there is actually stored in that variable. Does that make sense? So for value types, those primitive types, the value is actually stored in that variable that I have a name of, right? What does that mean? So if I say int x is 3, if I say int y is equal to x, and now I say y is 4, okay, what's an x after all, after those 3 lines? Huh?
3.
Still 3, right? What's in y? 4. 3 and 4, right? I made a copy on this line. I made a copy of whatever was an x over to y. So there's two. Those are 2 different places in memory, right? What happens if I say I've got a user object, and we'll call this A. We'll set this up, and we'll say, hey, his name is, we'll set this up and we say, hey, we're going to create a new user. We're going to give a name of Fred. Okay? All right, same thing here. I made a copy. Am I making a copy here?
No.
Not really.
Reference.
Not really. They're both referencing the same object, right? So right now, A and B point to the same object. So if I say b.name is equal to Bob,
Then it will change A as well.
right, then if I ask for the name of either A or B, I'll get the name as being Bob, because they're both pointing at the same object, right? So whenever I have a reference variable, right, so A and B are references, that means they're actually saying, okay, well, my data is actually somewhere over here. It's just a reference to where the data really is. Does that make sense? It's just a reference to where the data is really. Well, because the data is not actually here, I can say I'm null. I don't have a reference to anything. Does that make sense?
So before it goes and like kind of looks it up, it's null.
Yeah, and typically null is represented by 0. So typically we don't put anything at any objects at address 0. And we just say, well, 0 is like the special number, but I see 0 and I say, oh, there's nothing there.
Is that why, well, I just did a little C++ and if you do like int name, you do return 0, which means, yeah.
That's something different. I don't want to go into that. That's 0 actually means something different there. It's a bit different.
Cool.
Yeah. Main returns an integer, not a pointer. So that's important to know. So anytime I have a value type, it behaves differently than when I have a reference type, right? Because here I'm making copies, here I'm not making copies. Okay. So when I'm setting up forms, I'm setting up models like this, I'm generally going to put that question mark for optional anytime I have a value type, not when I have a reference type. Does that make sense? Okay. So that is our model. Notice the namespace that is put it in. Partyinvites.models. Remember where were the controllers? What namespace were those in? Huh?
Controller.
Partyinvites.controllers, right? And that's based on which folder it's in, right? If I'd put this model into the controllers folder, it would have been .controllers, which is not what I want. So I want to make sure I'm putting these in the models, and I want to make sure I'm putting those in the controllers. Okay? Next up. So we want to now have a link from the main home page to the other page. So to do that, I'm going to add a little bit of razor to do that. At html.actionLink RSVP now. Okay. Notice the little suggestion beneath where I'm writing this in. It's telling me what these things represent, right? So I see link text. That's the link text. This is the action name. Okay? We'll run this and show you what that means. So link text, action name. So what you can see here is that first argument that I gave it is the actual text that it's going to show to the user. And that second argument tells you which action it's going to go to. Look at the bottom left when you hover over that link. It's going to go to home RSVP form, right? So because I haven't specified a controller, it's going to assume that I'm still on the home controller, right? But it's going to go to the action that I told it to go to, which is RSVP form. Okay. Now, if I follow that, let me go ahead and put that in a paragraph. Put that in a separate paragraph. So it's just down there. Okay. If I follow this link, where is it going to take me? What am I going to get? I'm going to get a 404 error, right? Because that page doesn't exist yet. So let's create it. Okay. Let's create it. So I'm going to go back to my controller. I'm going to add an action for that. Public action result. And we're going to call it RSVP form. We're going to say just return the view. Okay. Somebody run that and tell me what you get. When you click the link now.
You get the same error from before because there's not a.
What's the text of the error?
Text of the error. It's searching through the home and the shared namespaces for an RSVP form.
What is the text of the error? The literal text of the error.
The view RSVP form or its master was not found.
Right. So it's telling you it can't find the view, right? And that's telling you where it comes from. So we need to create a new view, right? We haven't created a view yet. What is the name of that view that it's looking for? Huh? RSVP form. So by default, it's going to assume that the view is named the same as the action method. That's not required, and we'll get into later how we can do that differently. But generally, it's going to assume that those have the same name, that the view and your action method have the same name. So let's go create another view. Under Home, I'm going to call RSVP form. And we're going to tell it not to use a layout page. Okay. So it's going to give me an empty page like this.
What did you call that one?
I called it as RSVP form. Again, the same thing as what we've called the action method. So typically your action method and your view will have the same name. Okay. I'm actually going to delete this view and recreate it. I'm going to delete the RSVP form view and actually create it with a different pathway. Oh, no, never mind. I didn't need to. Anyway, view. I thought I did, but I don't actually need it. I just need to grab that way. Okay, so what I'm going to add to this, I'm going to add the first line to this RSVP form view. I'm going to add the word model. It's important that the letter M in model is lowercase. For this, M in model needs to be lowercase. So I'm going to say party invites dot models dot guest response. Remember, that's the name of the class that we created just a minute ago. Okay. So this line first up top is what we call a directive. It tells MVC what model that this view is assigned to work with. Okay. Because what we're going to do in a minute is we're actually going to, from the controller, we're going to send this model back and forth between the view. Okay. So what I now need to add is a bunch of code to the body of the page. Here we go. So if you're looking at it in the book, it'll be 30 and page 30 and 31. once you get all that code in, go ahead and run it and let me see what it looks like on your screen. In the same place. You still want to format that so it's easier to read. You're still missing some title. This needs to be this needs to be text. Text area consumptions and just value.
Getting some syntax errors, and I don't
We'll solve
understand
one
why.
for like 20 cents.
I'm getting syntax errors.
Maybe
saying choose an option.
You're gonna copy this one, the foot compare it.
Here's your closing parentheses. You don't want to semicolon. Oh, you have selected list. Select list.
Or buy them. Or bad.
You have to get the name exactly right. And then so it's just Right, so we've got a basic form laid out. Okay, let's talk about what the individual pieces mean. So on the outskirts around here, we've got this using begin form, right? Using begin form, right? So this kind of starts our form, and this curly brace here ends it, right? Let's do a quick look, and let's look at what the actual HTML looks like when we run this. And go run it and look at view page source. So if I go look here, view page source, you can see where I put the begin form, it's actually starting a form tag, and where I've closed it up, it's actually putting a closing form tag. You see that? Okay, so that's what that's about. It's creating that opening form tag and that closing form tag. Now notice that there's some additional stuff that's in there automatically, right? There's an action and there's a method property. Do you remember those from first semester?
Yeah.
So the method is going to tell how it's going to send it back to the server. Main two options are post or get. So by default, it's going to choose post. And by default, it's going to post it back to the same page that we're on, right? Which is home RSVP form. Okay. So by default, if I don't specify any option, it's going to send a post request back when the user submits it. Okay, that's important to know. You'll also notice what the actually goes to the browser. Again, like I said earlier, none of this razor syntax actually goes to the browser. The browser still is getting HTML. Right? So if we look at the code next to your email, what function am I calling? Because something's generating an input tag here. What is it?
Oh, the text box 4.
Text box 4. So HTML.textbox4. That HTML part is important. Don't forget it. So HTML.textbox4 is going to generate this text field, right? So text field is an input tag, type text. And it's going to go ahead and set both the ID and the name properties, right? So the ID and the name is set them both to what we gave as that first argument. What did we give as that first argument? We said x arrow x.name. It's an arrow function. Yes. Yes. What C# calls a lambda. Okay. Calls a lambda expression. It's shorthand for a delegate. Okay. Shorthand for a delegate. Well, that tells it what property of the model do we want to use, right? So that X represents the model, right? So we're saying the name property of the model. We want to put it here. Well, it's going to use that to say, okay, well, let's call this field name, email, etc. So it's gone and set both the ID and the name based on which property we're looking at. We're looking at the name property, we're looking at the email property, we're looking at the phone. Okay. Now, the name property, okay, that's the one that's going to get used when we send data back to the server. The ID one is the one that we're going to use when we're working with it in JavaScript. Does that make sense? So the name is actually what we care about when we're posting it back to the server, sending the data back to the server, but the ID is the one that we're going to use as we're working on the page. Now, one important difference there. ID. What's important about ID as far as HTML is concerned?
There has to be like only one unique one.
It has to be unique, right? I can't have two things on a page with the same ID. They have to be unique. But two things on the same page can have the same name. The name does not have to be unique. Okay? So, for instance, let's say I've got 3 forms. Well, they can all have a name input box called name. They just have to have a different ID.
Can like that form have like 2 name ones, or does it have to be one per form?
It can actually have 2 names. Even one form can have 2 fields with the same name. What it ends up sending it back to the server, let's say I've got 2 fields with the name email. It'll send it back to the server as an array. Which is nice and it's very helpful, especially
just like replace the one that came before.
because you can hijack that for things like, hey, I want the user to be able to upload multiple files. So here's a file box, or things of that sort. I want the user to send a list of things.
I'm guessing the order of the array is the order of the inputs in the HTML.
Yes, yes. By default, it will be sent back in the same order that it is in the HTML. Okay. So that's important to know. So it's going to create our text boxes like such. So that's how we set those up. Okay. I could actually directly use input tags here if I wanted to, right? If I wanted to, I could directly put input tags here. Okay. The reason I'm not going to put input tags there is because this is actually going to do a lot of magic for me in a bit, right? As we go through the
Is there a ranking jacket?
Huh?
Is there an extra ranking jacket?
Yes, there is.
So as we go through the next few weeks, you'll see there's a lot of magic that this does by using what we call these HTML helpers. Anything where you see HTML.this, that's an HTML helper. So we've got 3 different HTML helpers that we see here. We've got HTML begin form, text box 4, and drop down list 4. Okay. So those are going to do things like make validation easier, and that's the big thing that they do. Make validation easier, make it easier to send data back and forth to the server.
How would you change the type?
Huh? How do you change the type? It's a good question. It's a very good question. Why might you want to change the type?
It's a password.
The password. Yeah, you might want to change it to be a password. Well, password's easy. You just say password for it instead of text box for it. Okay? Password's easy. You just use a different helper. What about a number? Or URL or email? What if I want to say, I want this actually to be validated, I want it actually to be type email. So there is a trick, comma, oftentimes there's additional stuff you need to add. I need to add additional attributes to the HTML. In order to do that, all I have to do, so I'm going to start here as HTML, I'm going to pass it in as a name parameter to this function. So I'm going to say HTML attributes colon, say new. Well, what's that type? What's the additional information I want? I'm going to say type is equal to email.
So is that just like an overloaded function?
So it overrides basically anything you need to override. So I want to run that in there. And now if I look at it, see it's type email. So anything I need to change like that is super easy. It's super easy. In fact, if I want to give it a different ID, same process. If I want to give it a CSS class, there is something magic I have to do. I do have to use an @ sign there. That's simply because class is a keyword in C#. So because of that, I have to say at class. So at class, just going to reformat this a little bit. At class, and let's say we want to bring in the Bootstrap class for that. So that would be form-control. If I run that, what you'll see, again looking at the code, so I've added a class there. So I can add a CSS class, I can change the type, I can change any HTML attribute I want.
So is that what you would do for all elements?
So anything where I have a box like this that's an input field, I can change those properties. Relatively simple. There are some other ways to do that, and we'll walk through those for validation purposes. I may want to do something else, but let's just start with that.
Does creating these elements programmatically through C# cause less strain on the database?
No.
In the long run? Okay.
No. No. It has no effect.
Okay.
So
Has no
it's
effect.
just, more efficient.
It means that you have to write a lot less code.
Right.
So by using these HTML helpers, you reduce how much code you have to write. You could still write this entirely in HTML and use the input tags and write out all the validation yourself. But I'd really like to have MVC do most of my validation for me on the forms without having to write a lot of validation code. So that's if I don't use this, that's the problem, is I have to do all the validation myself.
So if you're working with like a template or something, would you want to replace all the validation that the template uses, or?
It depends on what you're using for a template, but I don't want to get into that right now. So it depends on what you mean by a template. So text box 4 gives me a text field. Drop-down list 4 gives me a drop-down list. So the first argument to that is to say what's the value, what field is that associated with. So it's associated with will attend, right? So will attend is what data type again? It's a nullable bool. It's a nullable bool. So it can have 3 values. What are those 3 values it can have?
Null, true.
Null, true, or false, right? So by default, it's going to be null. Initially, it's going to be null. We have one option here. Here's the text of that option. And then value is the value of that option, right? So it says, yes, I will be there, but the actual value of it is true. No, I can't come home, but the actual value is false, right? So notice that both the text properties and the value properties here, they're both strings, right? They're both strings. If I look at the HTML that we're generating for this, notice when I have this generates a select tag, okay? Inside of that we've got options. Each of those options represents something we have in the dropdown. So the first option, see it's got value blank, and says choose an option. The second option, here we've got yes, I'll be there, true, no, I can't come, false. Now there's something interesting here. What do you notice about this? Did I put that in there?
No.
That's the entity code.
It's any code for a single quote. And it just automatically figured that out. So typically speaking, anything you put in as data, that's the other thing that these HTML helpers will do, was go ahead and treat that data as data and escape it whenever it needs to be escaped. Because otherwise, if I put this in directly, I would have to know to escape it, potentially. So it'll automatically escape things like that. Okay. So looking at drop-down list, you can see that the first option is what? The first option, looking here, it says expression is the name of it. The second thing is the select list. And then you can see what the third thing is called option label. So option label is that default text that it's going to show and be select as the first thing in the dropdown, right? It's going to be selected by default. Always, always, always put in that option label. It's not required, but you always want it because otherwise users, well, you'll find a lot of users picking the first thing in the list because it won't force them to pick anything. They'll just submit the form with the first thing selected. So by putting that option label in, it gives you a way to check and find out if they've actually picked something or not.
That
Okay.
might be a good time for a break.
Now would probably be a good time for a break. So let's come back at 3:15.
I'm the same here, I don't feel like it, but peace, y'all.
So we've kind of looked at drop-down list for, we kind of talked about text box for. I didn't really say too much about begin form. The big thing I want to talk about here, see this keyword using. Have you seen the keyword using before?
Yes.
You've seen it in a different context, right? Mm-hmm.
I can't remember.
Opening the file.
So let's go look at home controller. You see the keyword using right up at the top. Okay. So this is what we call an import. A better word for that in this case is this is an import. And we're saying, hey, I want to use all the classes in that namespace, is what I'm saying in this case. This usage, this particular usage of the using keyword actually is something completely different. I really hate that Microsoft used the same keyword for both. Because it is something completely different. So this usage of using is actually, originally it was intended as a way to clean up resources when you're done with them, such as open a file, make sure it gets closed. That's the original usage of this. Well, here's the thing. It's actually a very useful construct and actually is used for a lot more things than that, and I've found a lot more usages. And there's a lot of places that I've used it beyond just that, and people have used it. So it's gotten used for a lot of other things. What it actually does, so we said begin form, okay? This creates an object. This creates an object that specifically implements the interface iDisposable, okay? Implements the interface iDisposable. iDisposable has only one thing in it, a method called dispose. So we're saying whatever this returns, which in this case it says it returns an MVC form, it has a method called dispose because it implements the iDisposable interface. So what happens is we create this object, we create this form, when we get to this closing curly brace down here, it's going to call dispose on that object. Well, calling dispose on that object puts the closing form tag there. That's about what you need to know. So it's a lot of interesting semantic sugar to put the closing tag there, basically is all it is. So treat this as your opening tag for the form, treat this as your closing tag for the form, and that's usually basically what matters.
What happens if you don't use it?
If you don't put the using keyword there, the form won't be closed. You only have a start tag. You'll only have a begin. You'll only have the form tag at the beginning, and you won't have the closing tag.
So if you had anything,
Or you might end up with two closing tags. All depends on how it decides to do it. But make sure that you're having the using in there to make sure the closing form tag gets in the right place.
I was going to say, otherwise anything you have after the form will be included in it.
Yeah, which is not what you want. So that's what we need to do to set up the interface there. Okay. A next thing we want to do, and this is kind of side channel to what we've done so far. Note that when I run this program, now that I've got 2 pages, it's actually going to start on the RSV form page. You see that? Rather than starting on the home page. So depending on my application, oftentimes I want it really to start at the home page all the time, regardless of where I am when I tell the program to run. To do that, I'm going to go to the Solution Explorer. I'm going to right-click the project, go to Properties. I'm going to go down to Web. And you notice here what's checked by default is current page. So current page, if you've got a view open, it will try to open the action associated with that view. If you don't have a view open, then it will just go to the home page. So what we want to instead do is push this over to specific page and leave it blank. That will mean it always goes to the home page when you tell it to run, regardless of where you actually are at the time. Does that make sense? So selecting specific page will tell it to go to this specific page. By default, that is the home page. So I could put in there, let's say we want to start on the RSVP form. I could say home/RSVP form. If I put that there, then when I run the application, it'll always start on the RSVP form when I run it from Visual Studio. But I'm going to leave that blank so it always starts at the home page. That make sense? So just a quick improvement. I would definitely recommend applying that on all your projects because it is going to make life easier. Especially when we start getting into the CRUD functionality where the ID is not there automatically.
Is it just looking for like a home keyword in the file, or how does it know what's the home page?
What it means by home page, well, it's going to go to the root of your website, which is what? It's localhost : port number.
Oh, right. Okay.
So it's going to go there. And then it would tack on whatever you had in that field after the port number.
Okay.
Right? But if I just put it in there with the port number, that's going to be the home page. So that's all I need to do. Okay, handling forms. So when I click submit right now, let's just see what happens when I try to submit the form out. So I run the application, it's going to start here on the home page. If I submit it, regardless of whether or not I type anything in, it's just going to say, okay, it's good. And then it looks like it's refreshing the page. And we type in some data. Test, submit the form, it's gone. Not very useful, right? So what I need to do is put in some code to tell it what to do when the user submits the form, right? So let's go back to the home controller and let's start writing that code out. So I'm going to go to the view action, and I'm actually going to mark this one with a special attribute. So HTTP get, okay? Which means that this action method is only accessible over the get method, right? Remember how our form is posting? Our form is, when we submit the form, it's going over post. Okay, I have 2 options. I can go over get or post. Whenever I navigate to a page, normally it's going to be over get. The only time it's going to be over post is if I'm submitting a form or sending AJAX requests. So HTTP get post. So now I have a get version and I have a post version. Okay. Well, what I'm going to put in here in the post form, I'm going to take some parameters, and specifically I'm going to take our model objects. So I'm going to say, when you post it, I want a guest response object. Now, that's in red underline. Why is that in red underline?
You just
Need to include the namespace.
Yeah, I haven't imported it. So show potential fixes, party invites models. Remember, I need to do that because it's in the models namespace, whereas my controller is in the controller's namespace. So it needs to know, hey, where do I find it? So now it knows where to find guest response. And put a quick to-do in here. To-do, email the response to the party organizer. And then I'm going to say some additional arguments in here. Okay. So what this does, now that I'm passing parameters into this view method, the first parameter tells it actually what's the name of the view do you want me to show. So in this case, when you post it, I'm actually going to show the thanks view instead of showing the RSV form for view. And then I'm also sending the actual data that the user sent to us to that view. So I'll be able to see that on that view. Okay? So I've roughly put that in there. I'm going to go ahead and add a new view. Add view. We're going to call this thanks. I am going to go ahead and create that there. Empty without model. And I'm just, for now, I'm just going to say H1. Okay. All good. So if you run that now, when you submit the form, you should see the key. You should see in big bold letters, thanks. If you have a guest response to these party invites, right? Because this is our code. System is any code that's not. System is any code that's not ours, but it's in the models. So you see now. No. And go back to the home controller. I'll bring that up there. So that's the code I have. So you see how it's in another one? If you hover over it, it should suggest the change. So you show potential fixes. So you say it's using party invite submods. So you can suggest a change.
I think it's great about this IDE and this.
Well, before you do that, let me do that real quick.
Yeah, if you could do that.
Because I can actually go to
Amazing.
suggestion.
I don't know. Nothing for now.
I'm showing them small.
I haven't refreshed this yet.
So right now, I think what's happening is to get. Do you know what a get is? To get get is like a query for the database.
This means
So one version of Test is like putting data, new data into the database. So it's like right now,
You're sending information to a server. So like you're sending seconds.
But right now,
And then it's responding with, I guess.
Okay. So we have that, we should have that, I think everybody's got that plumbing in. So you go to the home page, you go to the form, you submit the form, it's going to give you things. Even if you leave everything blank, right? So let's fix that so that if we leave it blank, it's going to go ahead and tell us that there's a problem. Okay? So if I go to my model, what I need to do in order to enforce the rules for validation, I need to add a bunch of properties, a bunch of attributes to each of these fields. So for the name, I'm going to say it's required. Tell what error message. Notice that it's showing up in red here because it doesn't know where to find this required attribute. Again, if I hover over this, you're going to see show potential fixes. I'm going to say using system component model data annotations. That's the namespace that those are in. So system component model data annotations. That's what we need. I'm going to add one of these for each of the properties. Each of the properties I'm going to say, hey, these are all required. And that's going to specify if you don't fill in a value, here's the error message.
What did you do to make it not error output using system?
So that's how in MVC we can use these attributes to just specify, hey, what are the validation constraints for this object, and what are the error messages that we want to show if they're not satisfied. Right, so let's try this. Let's see what it does right now. We've just added those. I'm going to go ahead and tell it to run without debugging. So at the form, it still says thanks. Okay, so there's a little bit more I have to do. So I'm going to go back to the home controller, and I'm going to say if model state dot is valid, if it's not valid. If it's not valid, then I need to do something else. So if it's not valid, I'm just going to return view So if there's anything wrong where it's not valid, I'm just going to show the view again with the data that they already entered. Okay. So if I type something in, it'll keep the value, but it's still not telling the user that something's wrong. Okay? So in order to tell the user what is actually wrong, we do have to put some code into the view. So I'm going to go back into the RSVP form view. And you see I've got text box 4, right? So beneath each of these, I'm going to add a div. Inside that div, I'm going to say @html.validation message for. So that's going to show the error message. So now, once you get those in, go ahead and give it a try. See what happens if you leave yours blank. Get your quotes in the wrong place. See, so RC form should be a string, so you need a quote at the end of that. It looks like you're missing a few things from the install instructions, so please make sure you follow all the instructions for the install. Because you should have, like, see, I have a run without debugging button in there. You want to have that.
What line is that?
So go ahead and I would have just added Directive in my toolbar because that makes it go a little faster. So you see it's still submitting it, so you're missing something. Right. Guess response. We have what those things required. Oh, go back to home controller. That should be not. If it's not valid, then we know. You need a monthly program. You need to that's an exclamation mark at the beginning. Not a end. So you're saying yeah. So if it's not valid, then you have because it was go ahead and format it. There you go. So that's what you should see. Okay, so you got an error message for each of those. You're still missing an error message for this. So you see how I have validation message 4 after the last one? Those zeros shouldn't actually be inside of it. Oh, the P is the start. I don't know what it is. Put it back in. That's the start of this. So we actually want that. Okay. If you select all that and go Shift Tab, it'll push it out the side. So anyway, so you need a validation message after that paragraph. to show messages for that.
Just constantly go over the way controls.
So go back onto the main project.
Those are all the edits.
What's going on?
Yeah, that's where all the like, data got stored.
Okay, you're backwards. Look at my, your code is backwards.
You're saying if it's not valid, go ahead and go to the next. It should look like that. If it's not valid, you show the form again. Otherwise, you go to the. So you should, I think most of you at this point, you should be at a point where you click submit, you're going to see error messages there beneath the fields, right? They're not very pretty. They're not very pretty. We'd really like them to show up probably in red, right? So the ideal way to do that would be to bring in Bootstrap, right? So let's go do that. There is one way that the book is going to show you how to do it with NuGet. The way I would actually recommend doing this, and the way I'm going to ask that you do this for most assignments, is to bring it in via CDN. Okay? So if we go to the Bootstrap website, getbootstrap.com, documentation, under getting started, you'll find the CSS and the JavaScript that you need. So I'm going to take the CSS link, that style sheet. I'm going to put it in here in the head. I'll put the style sheet in there, and then I'm also going to grab the 3 scripts that I need for Bootstrap and add them in there as well. Now, one note here. I'm actually going to put the style sheet up in the head, and I'm going to put the scripts down at the bottom of the body. That may or may not have been what you learned how to do, right? How many of you, just as by a show of hands, learned to put your script tags in the head?
I think I learned that, but I changed that.
Okay. So, can anybody tell me why I might want to put those scripts tags at the bottom of the body instead of at the head?
So the JavaScript doesn't try to interact with elements that haven't like loaded yet.
Correct. Right. So that's one reason. There's another reason. How about the next person?
Load faster.
What do you mean load faster? Because yes, but what? But give me an explanation of that.
JavaScript takes longer to load, and well, it at least causes this page to appear to load faster because all of the HTML elements will load before it starts to run JavaScript.
Okay, so let me kind of explain it from my side. So if I put the script tags in the head, okay, let's say I do that. It will then start running that JavaScript. All the JavaScript codes that's in those scripts, it'll download them and run them before it reads anything else before it reads anything in the body. Which means if there's a lot of wrong running code, if it takes 5 minutes to download that and then run that JavaScript code, guess what? The user's looking at a blank white screen for 5 minutes. That's really bad. Really, really bad. So that's the big reason that I want to do that, is I don't want the JavaScript code to run until they've seen the page. Because until they've seen the page, it's probably not worth them seeing the JavaScript code anyway. So that's part of it. The other thing is, like you said, yes, we've got to wait for the DOM to load. Nearly all of our JavaScript code will touch the DOM. So there's no point in loading the JavaScript before the DOM's loaded. And generally speaking, if I put it down at the bottom, all of the DOM will be loaded by the time I get to them. So I'm going to put all my scripts at the bottom. I'm going to put my CSS at the top. Okay, so we've added Bootstrap in. Great. That makes it very simple for me to then mark these with some classes. So class, text, danger. And I'm just going to apply that to all of these divs. And that should be enough to make the messages show up in red. So I got Bootstrap on this file, and I also have some nice highlighting for the message. And what does that mean? So everything that you've learned about Bootstrap, everything you learned about Bootstrap in the first semester, it applies here. Just bring it into the CDN.
So, could you also do it by like adding style like the other way?
The other way you would do it is through a new get package. Which the book will walk. If you walk through the steps in the book will show you how to do that. So I'll let you read the book on that front. But this is, I'd say, what will be a CDN?
Like for the validation on message board, like an attribute that says class and
Yes, I could. Assuming that that's created as a string. But here I'm already putting in the div because I want it to show up below. And well, that applies to anything that's not. So yes, I could do it that way as well. But because of how I want it to lay out, it's just easier to do it this way.
Could you just go over how, like, the sequence of control being passed throughout the application, like where everything is going?
What do you mean?
Just like following everything through the MVC model. Just so I know, like, I think I have a grasp on how it's all being sequenced, like as you go from page to page, but I'm not 100% sure. I just wanted to go over it.
I want to make sure that everybody's got. Is there any questions on what's already here? On the code here, is there anybody that's still typing, still writing? Sounds like a no. Okay. So you're asking about what's the kind of life cycle, right? So effectively, let's I open up this page. Let me go back to the home page. So I'm on the home page, right? And remember, it's going to find that because home index is just the default, right? I click on the link. Where does the link take me to? Specifically from the browser standpoint, where does it take me?
Is it the home controller?
It's going to take me home controller, RSVP form, action, right? And in fact, going to that, clicking on this link is the same as typing it into the browser, right? So clicking on this link is the same as just directly typing that in and going there. Okay? No difference. No difference. So the fact that we are on the home page doesn't really matter. Is that clear? We didn't have to go through the home page to get here. Your users will, but you don't have to. Okay? So where is it going to go when I sell it to go to home RSVP form? Well, it's going to go look at the home controller, right? It's going to go look for an action method with the name RSVP form, right? Well, there's two of them, right? One of them that is get and one that is post. So it's going to have to somehow pick which one to go to. Well, when I just type in a URL to the browser, what method does it come in as? What HTTP method?
Get.
It comes in as a get, right? So the initial version of the page is going to be this action method, right? It's going to run that action method. That action method says, just show the RSVP form view, right? So it's going to say, okay, we'll show the form with the show the view with the same name as my action method. So we're going to show this. I didn't give it a note that I didn't give it a model display, right? I didn't give it a model to display. So when I go and run this, my model is going to be null. My model is null for this first time through. Okay. It automatically handles that and just makes all the fields blank. Okay, by the model being null. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So here the model is null. It's showing all these fields. When I actually submit it, let me go look at this. So I'm going to say put in some values. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to hit F12 here so we can kind of look at what's it actually sending to the server. I'm going to go to the Network tab, hit Submit. If I look over here, you kind of can see what it has sent to the server. So I've sent here RSVP form. You can see that the method is post. And if I scroll all the way down, you can see the form data that's sent to the server, right? So it's sent, name is foobar, email is yay, phone is 1234. So that gets sent to the server, right? This is what it's actually sending. If I say view source here, that's what actually the text that's sent to the server, right? So it's just sending those values to the server. It's sending blank as will attend, okay? Now server is going to come and see that. So I'm going to actually run this with the debugger here a second so we can see those values in here. So I put a breakpoint. I'm running with the debugger attached. And what broke?
It could have been because there already an instance of localhost.
Maybe. Well, that's weird. I'm not hitting that. Is that because I'm running something else? Oh, it's on HTTP. Well, this is interesting because breakpoint. Well, no, I know breakpoints work. I've used them before.
Like now the home page is loading, but before you add that breakpoint on the get one.
But that's definitely not the problem.
Yeah. I don't know why it would be.
So it's not the recording software that's causing that problem. Why is it not running with the debugger? Okay, well let's just try running it with a different web browser. So I'm going to run it through Edge. Okay, so it's fine here. I don't know what's up. Okay, so foobar test and 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to go ahead and say no, I can't come, or I'm going to leave that blank. Okay, so now I'm on a breakpoint here. So this is, I've just submitted the form, right? So I've just gotten into this method. Well, let's look at what's in the guest response object. See, it's going ahead and magically just put the values there. Because they're the same name, right? What was sent back, those values are the same name as the properties. Because the fields, the input fields, are the same name as the properties, right? So magically it's created this object out of thin air that has everything that I posted. Okay. It's also magically gone and figured out that it's invalid. And it figured out that it was invalid because of the validation constraints that I put on my model, right? Because I'm telling it that I take a guest response as the input, and because I've got these required attributes here, it's magically figuring out, oh, well, this required attribute wasn't satisfied, so therefore it's invalid. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's figured out it's invalid, so therefore when we go to the next thing, we step over, see it's going to return, show the RSVP form again, but with that model instead of null this time, right? So that's why it's going to redisplay those values that I've already entered, because I've told it, here's the values that these are already entered.
So that's why that's why it's a post then, because you're giving data to.
No, it's a post because the form, the method on the form is post.
Okay.
If the method on the form was get, it would be get. Okay. Typically all your forms, most of them except for search forms, are going to be post.
Okay.
Okay. Nearly all of your forms are going to be post. And at this point all of them should be post. Okay. So that's what happens when we don't have all the values. Okay? So I'm going to submit this again with all the values filled in. Yes, I'll be there. This time you can see that true is set for will attend, and if I look at the model state, it is valid, right? So we're going to step over, it's going to go down to this line of code, and we're going to show that thanks screen. Does that make sense? So any code that we need to do here for sending that email, right, we're going to put that in between here because that code's going to run if it's valid.
Yeah, that helped a lot. Thank you.
Okay.
What is the guest response in the thanks line do?
Which line?
On the line, yeah.
Nothing right now.
Okay.
Nothing right now. That's just passing it down to the thanks view. But we haven't done anything with it yet.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and do something with that. So the first thing I need to do again is specify the model. And we're going to have that be party invites .model .guest response. And then beneath this here, well actually I'm going to change this. This is going to be thank you at model.name And then I'm going to put a little bit of conditional logic here based on whether or not they said that they could attend. So if they could attend, we're going to say model.will attend. If it's true, so now I'm using that model to do something.
So can't you just do if model.will attend?
Yes, you could in this case. Yes.
Oh, duh.
So you notice that both of those messages that I'm outputting are starting with the characters at and then colon.
Well, also, I found out you actually can't use it. You actually have to include the equals true because it's nullable.
It should show figure it out. Okay.
So yeah, what does that have?
What does that mean? What happens if I leave it out? What happens if I leave that colon out? Check out the outside of that. So if I don't put anything there, I just start with sorry, or I just start with it's great, it's starting to interpret that as C# code. Right? It's starting to interpret that as C# code because I'm inside of an else or an if. Right? Because as soon as I said else or else, like if or else, it's saying, oh, well, you're in C# land. Everything you write should be C# code. So it's trying to interpret it as C# code because there's no reason to think otherwise. So the question at colon is just to say, well, what's actually here is not C#. It's just plain text. I just want you to show this to the user. Don't treat this as C#.
It's almost like it's on escape.
It actually is. We're escaping out of C#. So that's the basic setup. Okay. Have we satisfied all those original desires? Have we satisfied all the user's original requirements? Have we made them happy?
No, we haven't emailed them.
We haven't emailed them. Okay. We haven't sent an email out to them. So let's fix that. I'm going to scroll. He does this a little bit later, so I'm going to do this a little bit earlier, a little bit different. There it is. So I'm going to go back to the home controller. This to do here. I'm going to say, well, we need to try to send the email out. It could fail. It could very well be that sending out the email fails, in which case we need to show an error message to the user so that they don't think that their RSVP has been sent in. Okay. So I'm going to say try catch. Whatever exception occurs, I'm going to tell the user Sorry, it failed. So return So I'm going to say 500 code if it doesn't go through. To send it, I'm going to use I need to set the host. Note I'm not filling in some values yet, just because we're going to have to look them up. And they may be, I can't remember if they're going to be different for everybody. SMTP dot from now for from, I would strongly recommend that you use your own email address. You're going to use your own, preferably a Gmail address, because we're going to hook this up with Gmail in a second. Oh, I'm messing something up here. Create a message. Message equals new. Email address. Message dot to and
We're just sending that to ourselves.
yes, yeah, you'll be sending that to yourself. There it is. Message dot subject is equal to what subject line does he have on here? RSVP notification. And then dot Wilton. My syntax is not right here.
Single quotes, double quotes.
Okay, we have to do it a different way then. It's not working as well as I would hope. There we go. So it's going to say their name is, and then either it basically is attending or is not attending is what we're going for. So that's the message body that we want to be sent out. Send. We're going to send the message. So effectively, if that all works out, and that's going to send it through. Now, where do we get this host and port? This is going to be a really good question. So if we go to Inside Rankin, I've already linked an article for this of how to use Gmail's SMTP server that's actually free. So I'm going to go to the course. Down under bookmarks, there's Google SMTP server. You may be able to find this with just a simple Google search, but here's the page. So what you can see as being the host is going to be smtp.mail.gmail.com. You need to tell it a few different things there. So all of that stuff is things you're going to need to specify in the SMTP client in order to make it work. So from there, I'd ask you to kind of get your own information, put that in there, see if it works. Let me know if you have trouble getting that working. Because obviously you're going to have your own password and username in there.
Can you go back to the code for a second?
Mm-hmm. So here you're going to need to add some stuff in.
Wait, so is the port different for everyone?
The host and the port should be the same,
Okay.
but there's some additional things on that page you need to set in. Specifically, your username and password should be different. But you have to try it. It says 465 or 487. I would try 465 and see if that works. It's been a while since I've tested that out.
Where do we go to change that? All this stuff right here?
So that's the page. You're going to need to set those things on the SMTP client. So you've got the SMTP client object that I created at the top. You'll need to set those settings as properties.
Oh, okay. Do that.
Do that through code.
So.
Oh, I see. I think you guys. Sorry.
You can do it straight.
I'm missing something.
That is credential. What do you have in there? What's that? To new network credential. And then it takes 2 arguments. The first being your email, the second being your password.
New what?
Network credential.
Credential.
One, no, that's not.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't think it's that much either. You don't want it to be running on a server, people not being able to access it.
Yeah.
Is there a way to get past it in 2-step?
No, that will.
Is there what?
What if you have 2-step?
Two-factor? It shouldn't matter. Shouldn't matter.
What do you do for user authentication? What was that? For user authentication. I really don't. I'm sorry, I really.
No, you're fine.
Looks like I'm doing something wrong though.
I don't think it forces stuff out. It's got yeah, I have that in. I don't think it'll try to report it, but it's gonna throw on as well.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So it's just 25 now.
Oh.
Like 67.
Course is 500, like give me 500 years.
I apologize for asking for that password, but that thing.
They may have changed a few things.
Also, when I looked it up on the SMTP,
Uh-huh.
it said it was an obsolete class.
It was what?
It said the class SMTP client is obsolete.
I think you're being dead close to that.
Also, it's 425 now.
Yeah, it's 425. So I'll take a look. I'll see what I can come back with. That's not the biggest part of this. What I would recommend, you kind of saw how to start setting up Bootstrap. You know, go through the rest of the chapter and kind of walk through what he does to make it look prettier, and then add some things to it, because you can add images to the front part and font awesome and all those kind of pieces that we covered in the first semester. So we'll finish that up tomorrow. I'll see you then.
So do the pictures and stuff tonight?
Yeah, keep working on that website, keep working through chapter 2, because we'll finish up chapter 2 tomorrow and we'll go on with chapter 3. I'll kind of figure out what's going on with that email thing. You didn't make your homepage, the homepage that you're talking about.
Let's go back here. So you want to right click on the project and go to properties. And you want to set go to web. Remember we went over this? So you want to go to a specific page. That way you'll always start on the homepage when you start the application. Because right now it's trying to start on the thanks page. Remember, there's no action method for thanks.
That's the problem. It looks like that.
Yeah, it's definitely.
Hey. I don't need to send it here. I was gonna send an email real quick if you don't mind. I know we were gonna work together on.
Oh, before you do that, can I shut a few things down? Like the recording, because it's currently recording.